The lecture hall stretched wide and tall like a cathedral made of glass and silver light, filled with students from 40 different worlds across the galaxy, who had gathered to learn at the most prestigious institution in known space, the Galactic Confluence Academy, where only the brightest minds earned the right to study advanced sciences and mathematics beyond what most civilizations could even comprehend. Professor Velkith stood at the front of the massive chamber on a platform that floated 3 meters above the ground, so all students could see their crystalline form that reflected light in prismatic patterns whenever they moved or spoke through the translation device that converted their resonance patterns into words every species could understand in their own way of hearing and processing language. The Luminar Collective had produced the greatest mathematicians and theoretical physicists in galactic history for the past 10,000 years, and Professor Velkith embodied everything their species represented, brilliant beyond measure, precise in every calculation, and absolutely certain of their intellectual superiority over nearly every other form of life that had ever evolved in the cosmos. Today we return your examinations on advanced quantum field theory, Velkith announced, and their voice carried the harmonic frequencies that made even difficult concepts seem elegant when they explained them to students who struggled with material that pushed the boundaries of what most species could process mentally, one by one. The professor called students forward to receive their graded examinations and offered brief comments on their performance, whether praise for the Tetherian student who showed exceptional understanding of wave function, collapse, or gentle correction. For the Varath, whose mathematical notation needed refinement but showed promise in grasping the underlying concepts, then came the name that always made Velkith's crystalline structure dim with something between disappointment and contempt. Sarah Chun, a human female, rose from her seat in the back of the hall where she always sat quietly observing and taking notes on a primitive paper tablet rather than using the holographic recording systems every other student employed for their studies. Because humans insisted on clinging to their ancient methods even after being accepted into galactic civilization only 50 years prior, Sarah walked down the long aisle between rows of seats occupied by beings with multiple heads. Beings made of living gas contained in environmental suits. Beings who existed partially in other dimensions and could barely be perceived by creatures locked into standard space-time like humans were with their limited sensory apparatus and slow biological processing speeds. She reached the floating platform and stood waiting while Professor Velkith held up her examination paper for the entire class to see what appeared to be a completely blank sheet except for her name written at the top in standard galactic common script that every species learned as their first lesson when joining the interstellar community. Explain this, Velkith demanded, and their harmonic voice now carried undertones of mockery that made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats because public humiliation was not typical of academy teaching methods, but had become increasingly common. Whenever the professor dealt with their human student, Sarah looked at her exam paper without expression on her face and said nothing, which only seemed to fuel Velkith's frustration with this particular student, who had now submitted 6 consecutive examinations that appeared completely blank, despite the professor explaining multiple times that invisible ink or hidden answers would not be tolerated as some kind of joke or protest. This is the 6th time you have handed in a blank examination, the professor continued, and now their voice grew louder so every being in the hall could hear every word of what was becoming less a teaching moment and more a public execution of academic reputation. Perhaps humanity was not ready for admission to this institution after all, Velkith said, and several students gasped because questioning a species' right to academy membership was considered extremely controversial, even among those who privately agreed that Earth's inclusion had been premature given how recently humans had developed faster than light travel compared to most civilizations, who had possessed it for thousands of years. Perhaps your species' vaunted creativity and adaptability that your ambassadors spoke of so proudly during admission hearings was merely compensation for lacking the basic intellectual capacity to engage with truly advanced concepts. The professor went on, and now other students began whispering among themselves in dozens of languages that the translation field rendered into an incomprehensible murmur, filling the Halavara student with 4 arms and deep purple skin leaned over to their companion and whispered just loud enough for those nearby to hear. I heard humans still use base 10 counting because they have 10 fingers and never evolved beyond that primitive limitation. Others laughed at this observation, and the sound carried through the chamber like wind through tall grass, making Sarah the focus of hundreds of eyes and sensory organs from beings who had traveled light years to study here and now witnessed what they perceived as confirmation of their own species' superiority. Sarah stood perfectly still with her hands at her sides and her face showing no emotion whatsoever, which somehow made the moment even more uncomfortable for those students who possessed enough empathy to feel secondhand shame at watching someone being torn apart verbally by an authority figure who should have been mentoring rather than mocking. You will fail this course, Velkith announced with finality that seemed to close the matter entirely. You will be expelled from the academy and return to your homeworld, where perhaps you can find work more suited to your capabilities. The professor continued, and their words fell like hammer blows against stone. And perhaps the Galactic Council will reconsider whether Earth deserves representation in academic circles when their best and brightest cannot even complete a simple examination without leaving the answer sheets completely blank. Velkith finished and dismissed Sarah with a gesture that made their crystalline fingers chime like breaking glass. Sarah took her blank exam paper and walked back up the aisle while whispers followed her like shadows, and students from a dozen worlds watched her retreat with expressions ranging from pity to contempt to relief that they were not the ones being made an example of today in front of everyone. She sat down in her seat and carefully placed the exam paper in her bag along with her other materials while Professor Velkith continued to lecture as if nothing significant had happened, as if destroying a student's reputation and future was simply part of the day's lesson plan. But in the back of the hall, Sarah Chun allowed herself the smallest smile that nobody saw because she knew something that Professor Velkith did not yet understand. The exam was not blank, and the answers were all there waiting to be discovered by anyone who knew how to look properly at what humans could accomplish. When they stopped trying to imitate alien methods and instead embraced what made their species unique, the lecture continued for another hour, covering concepts that would take most civilizations centuries to develop, and Sarah took notes in her primitive paper notebook, using methods that would have seemed absurdly simple to any observer who bothered to watch her work instead of dismissing hers intellectually inferior. When class finally ended and students filed out discussing the day's humiliation of the human student, Sarah remained in her seat for a few extra minutes, reviewing her notes and checking her calculations one more time before nodding to herself with satisfaction and gathering her materials. She left the lecture hall and walked through corridors filled with beings from across the galaxy who had come here to learn and to prove themselves worthy of standing among the greatest minds civilization had produced, but none of them suspected that the greatest mind among them had just been mocked and dismissed and threatened with expulsion. Tomorrow would bring new classes and new challenges, but Sarah felt no anxiety about her situation because she understood something fundamental about the universe that even the brilliant Luminar Collective had not quite grasped. Intelligence came in many forms, and superiority was often just another word for blind spots that prevented seeing what existed right in front of you. The whole time the chemistry laboratory occupied an entire wing of the Academy's research complex, where students from various worlds conducted experiments that would advance their understanding of how matter and energy interacted at scales both cosmic and quantum in ways that challenged even the most established theories about how the universe functioned at its most fundamental levels. Zixor adjusted the compound lenses that covered 3 of their 4 primary visual organs and carefully measured out a solution of metallic compounds that would react with organic polymers in ways that demonstrated principles of molecular bonding their professor had discussed during the previous week's lectures on advanced chemical synthesis. The Therian species possessed extraordinary visual capabilities that allowed them to perceive wavelengths far beyond what most other beings could detect without technological assistance, and this natural ability made them exceptional chemists and material scientists who could literally see reactions happening at scales other species needed elaborate equipment to observe. Zixor had finished their experiment and was cleaning their workspace when another student bumped into them while carrying their own equipment, causing Zixor to knock over a container of organic solvent that splashed across the laboratory bench and soaked several papers that had been left there by previous students who failed to clean up properly after their work. "Apologies," the other student said in the clicking language of the krill before hurrying away to continue their own project. Zixor grabbed absorption claws to clean up the spill before it damaged any equipment and began wiping down the bench when they noticed something strange about one of the papers that had been soaked by the solvent. Under the bright laboratory lights, patterns were appearing on what had seemed to be a blank page. Their multiple eyes focused on the paper with increasing intensity as more and more tiny marks became visible, showing what looked like arrangements of small lines and dots that covered the entire surface in dense clusters that would have been invisible without the chemical reaction that was now highlighting them. Somehow curiosity overtook their initial annoyance at the mess, and Zixor picked up the paper carefully to examine it more closely under different lighting conditions, using the various spectrum filters available in the laboratory for analyzing samples that required observation beyond normal visible wavelengths. Under ultraviolet light, the patterns became even more distinct, and Zixor realized with growing amazement that someone had written on this paper at a microscopic scale that would have required either advanced technological assistance or incredible manual precision that seemed almost impossible for any biological being to achieve without mechanical aids. The name at the top of the paper read Sarah Chun, and Zixor remembered with uncomfortable clarity the scene from yesterday's lecture when Professor Velkith had publicly humiliated the human student for supposedly submitting blank examinations that proved her intellectual inadequacy and justified questioning whether humans belonged at the academy. But this paper was not blank, and the more Zixor looked at it, the more convinced they became that something extraordinary had been overlooked by everyone who had dismissed this student as incompetent or lazy or simply unable to meet the standards expected of Academy Scholar. Zixor carried the paper to an electron microscope station typically used for examining crystal structures and material defects at atomic scales, and carefully positioned the document under the scanning apparatus that would reveal details far beyond what even Therian eyes could perceive naturally. The screen flickered to life, showing magnified sections of the paper's surface and what appeared there made Zixor's breathing apparatus flutter with shock, because the tiny marks were not random patterns or decorative elements, but actual writing, composed entirely of 2 symbols repeated in long sequences, a vertical line and a small circle arranged in groups that clearly represented some kind of notation system binary code, and Zixor recognized it immediately because every species that developed computer technology eventually discovered Base 2 mathematics as the foundation of digital information processing, even though most civilizations moved beyond it quickly in favor of more complex systems that could store and process information more efficiently. But this was not computer code in the traditional sense, because no computer had written these symbols on paper. Someone had manually inscribed the binary notation at microscopic scales across the entire examination page. And when Zixor began the tedious process of transcribing the binary sequences into standard numerical notation, they discovered something that made their complex mind reel with implications: the examination questions for advanced quantum field. Theory had been answered and answered correctly, and answered with such depth and sophistication that the solutions went far beyond what Professor Velkith had taught in class, including derivations of proof theorems that Zixor had only seen in specialized research publications, read by perhaps a few dozen beings in the entire galaxy. Sarah Chen had not submitted a blank examination at all, but rather had encoded her answers in pure binary notation written at scales that required magnification to read, and had done so with such precision that every symbol was perfectly formed despite being smaller than most species eyes could resolve without technological assistance. Or spent the next 3 hours decoding the entire examination, and with each answer they transcribed their respect for the human student grew exponentially, because this was not merely answering questions correctly, but demonstrating mastery of concepts that even Zixor, who ranked among the top students in their cohort, struggled to fully comprehend. More than that, Sarah had included annotations and alternative derivations that suggested different approaches to solving the same problem, showing not just understanding but creative thinking that applied theoretical concepts in novel ways that had never occurred to Zixor, despite their species' reputation for mathematical innovation. When the decoding was complete, Zixor sat back from the workstation and contemplated what they had discovered and what it meant for their understanding of humans, and for Professor Velkith's assessment of Sarah's capabilities, and for the entire Academy's assumptions about which species possessed inferior intellectual abilities. This changed everything, but Zixor knew that simply explaining what they had found would not be sufficient, because beings believed what they could see with their own eyes and perception, and everyone had seen Sarah submit blank examinations repeatedly without any visible writing on them. They needed to show Professor Velkith directly, and they needed to do it in a way that could not be dismissed or explained away as some kind of trick or deception, because the implications were too important to be lost in arguments about methodology or evidence. Zixor carefully preserved the solvent-treated examination paper and then used their Academy credentials to access the record system where all submitted student work was stored in digital format for review and reference, and requested copies of Sarah Chun's previous examinations from Professor Velkith's course. The files arrived instantly, transmitted through the quantum network that connected every terminal in the Academy, and Zixor displayed them on screen. 6 examination documents that appeared completely blank, except for Sarah's name written at the top of each one in standard script. But Zixor now knew what to look for, and requested enhanced scanning protocols that could detect microscopic surface variations in the digital images. And when the enhancement algorithms finished processing the supposedly blank pages, erupted with dense patterns of binary notation that covered every square millimeter of available space. 6 examinations, and every single one filled with answers written in binary code at microscopic scales. And Zixor randomly selected the 3rd exam and began decoding its contents to verify whether this was consistent across all submissions, or perhaps a recent development. 40 minutes later, they had their answer. Sarah Chun had been writing her examinations in binary notation from the very first day, and had been answering every question correctly, while including additional analysis and theoretical extensions that demonstrated graduate-level comprehension of material most students struggled to grasp at basic level. Zixor made copies of all the examinations, along with their decoded translations, and compiled everything into a comprehensive report that documented exactly what they had discovered and how they had discovered it, including detailed microscope imagery that showed the binary notation clearly. Then they sent a formal request for an immediate meeting with Professor Velkith, marked urgent and requiring Attention within 24 hours, according to Academy. Protocols for addressing significant academic matters that could not wait for regular office hours. The response came back within minutes. Professor Velkith would see them tomorrow morning. The four classes began to discuss whatever matter Zixor considered so important that it warranted interrupting a Luminar's meditation cyclexer, organized their evidence carefully, and tried to anticipate how the professor would react to having their assessment of a student so completely overturned by what should have been obvious to anyone who looked carefully enough but had been missed, because everyone assumed humans were simply less capable than other species. Tomorrow would be interesting. Professor Velketh's office resembled a geometric crystal formation more than a traditional workspace with walls that refracted light into prismatic patterns and furniture that seemed to grow organically from the floor in shapes that accommodated the luminar physiology while leaving other species to find whatever seating worked for their particular body configuration. Sears stood before the professor's desk holding their compiled evidence while Velkith reviewed the materials with what appeared to be growing skepticism that showed in the way their crystalline structure dimmed and flickered as they examined each page of decoded examinations and microscope imagery. This must be some kind of elaborate deception, Velkith said after reviewing the first examination, and their harmonic voice carried frequencies that suggested they felt personally insulted by what they were seeing. The human has somehow fabricated these patterns after the fact, or used technology to inscribe them in ways that our standard scanning protocols failed to detect. The professor continued while refusing to accept the obvious explanation that they had simply been wrong about Sarah Chun's capability. Ashexer had anticipated this reaction and pulled up additional evidence, showing that the binary patterns existed in the original digital scans stored in the Academy's secure archives that had been captured immediately upon submission before the examinations ever left Sarah's possession. Then the scanning equipment has been compromised, Velkith insisted, though their voice now carried undertones of doubt that suggested even they recognized how unlikely such an elaborate conspiracy would be. With respect, Professor, perhaps the simplest explanation is the correct one, Zixor said carefully, because challenging Illuminar's assessment required diplomatic phrasing that acknowledged their expertise while gently suggesting alternative interpretations. Perhaps Sarah Chun has been answering the examinations correctly all along, and we simply failed to look closely enough. Zixor finished and waited while Velketh's crystalline form pulsed with light patterns that indicated deep processing of uncomfortable information. The professor sat in silence for nearly 3 minutes running probability calculations that their species could perform mentally faster than most civilizations' computers, and eventually the light patterns stabilized into what Zixor recognized as reluctant acceptance. Bring her here, Velkith said quietly, and their voice had lost all trace of the superiority and certainty that typically characterized their interactions with students. Bring Sarah Chun to my office immediately, and we will determine exactly what is happening with these examinations, the professor commanded, and Zixor bowed respectfully before leaving to find the human student who would somehow accomplish something that should have been impossible. Sarah was in the Academy library, reading what appeared to be an ancient paper book, rather than accessing the holographic information systems that contained exponentially more knowledge in more accessible formats, and she looked up when Zixor approached with an expression that suggested she had been expecting this conversation. Eventually, Professor Velkith wants to see you, Zixor explained, and Sarah nodded calmly, as if being summoned to the office of the professor who had publicly humiliated her was perfectly normal. They walked together through the Academy corridors, and Zixor found himself studying the human with renewed interest, trying to understand how someone so apparently ordinary by galactic standards had managed to achieve something that required either extraordinary natural abilities or technological assistance that should have been detected. How do you write so small, Zixor? Finally, asked because curiosity overcame their usual Tetherian reserve, practice, and discipline. Sarah answered simply without elaborating further. When they arrived at Velka's office, the professor was waiting with all 6 of Sarah's examinations spread across their desk, along with the microscope imagery and decoded translations that Zixor had prepared. "Explain this," Velkith demanded without preamble, and gestured at the evidence that contradicted everything they had believed about their human. Student Sarah looked at the materials calmly, and then met the professor's gaze with steady eyes that showed no fear or anxiety about the confrontation. "Binary notation is humanity's fundamental language of computation," Sarah began, and her voice carried the patient tone of someone who had explained this concept many times before. While other species evolved different counting systems based on their physiology or environmental factors, humans built our entire digital civilization on base 2 mathematics, she continued, while Velkith listened with what might have been the first genuine attention they had ever given to their human students' words. "Writing in binary at microscopic scales is a discipline taught at certain Earth institutions to develop precision focus and the ability to compress maximum information into minimum space," Sarah explained, and pulled a small case from her pocket. She opened the case to reveal several grains of rice and a tool that looked like a modified stylus with an incredibly fine point that gleamed under the office lighting. "May I demonstrate?" Sarah asked, and Velkith gestured permission with crystalline fingers that chimed softly. Sarah placed 1 grain of rice on the desk, and using the stylus, with movements so controlled they seemed almost mechanical, she began inscribing symbols on the rice grain's surface that were too small for unassisted vision to perceive. After 2 minutes, she handed the stylus to Zixor and gestured toward the microscope station in the corner of Velkith's office, because even luminar professors kept advanced equipment nearby for reviewing research material. Zixor examined the rice grain under magnification and saw written there in perfect binary notation a complete equation describing quantum entanglement at scales that required graduate level physics to comprehend fully. "I write my examinations this way to challenge myself," Sarah continued, while Velkith and Zixor stared at the magnified rice grain displaying on the monitor. "Standard notation seems wasteful when binary allows me to fit exponentially more information in the same space, and the discipline required to maintain precision at these scales helps me focus my thinking in ways that improve my overall comprehension," she explained, as if this were perfectly logical. "Why did you not explain this when I accuse you of submitting blank examinations?" Velkith asked, and their voice had lost all traces of hostility, replaced by something that might have been embarrassment. "You did not ask," Sarah said simply, and the statement hung in the air like an indictment of assumptions made without investigation. "I assumed you would examine the papers thoroughly before grading them, and when you did not, I assumed there was some academy protocol I had violated by using non-standard notation." Sarah continued with a shrug that suggested the entire situation had been an unfortunate misunderstanding. "I have been researching academy policies to determine whether binary notation is explicitly forbidden, but found no regulations addressing notation systems at all," she added, and pulled out her paper notebook filled with handwritten annotations. Velth realized with crystalline clarity that their dismissal of this student had not been based on evidence or investigation, but on prejudices about human capabilities that they had never questioned, because those prejudices aligned with what they wanted to believe about their own species' superiority. "I must review all of your examinations properly," the professor said, and their voice carried harmonics of contrition that Lumina rarely expressed to members of other species. "Your decoded translations appear accurate, but I must verify the content myself to understand what you have actually written," Velkith continued, while Sarah nodded acceptance. Over the next 4 hours, Professor Velkith worked through each examination systematically with Sarah and Zixor present. to clarify any questions about the binary notation or decoding process that might arise during the review. With each examination, the professor's crystalline structure flickered with increasingly complex light patterns that indicated processing of information that challenged their existing frameworks for understanding student capability. Sarah had not merely answered the questions correctly, but had solved problems in ways that demonstrated intuitive understanding of concepts that Velkith had spent decades studying, and had included derivations of theorems that extended beyond current published research in several significant areas. This work on reconciling wave-particle duality across dimensional boundaries, Velkith said, while pointing to decoded sections of the fourth examination. This has implications for a unified field theory that I have not seen addressed in any contemporary literature. Yes, Sarah agreed simply. I thought the connection was obvious once you accept that consciousness observation collapses probability functions through quantum resonance rather than direct interaction. Velkith stared at their human student with an expression that translated roughly to stunned disbelief, because what Sarah had just casually suggested as obvious represented a potential breakthrough that could reshape fundamental physics. You wrote this as part of an examination answer, the professor said slowly, as if confirming their understanding of what had occurred. The question asked about observation effects on quantum systems, and this seemed like the most complete explanation, Sarah replied, as if revolutionary. Theoretical physics were merely normal examination content. Professor Velketh's crystalline form pulsed with rapid light sequences that Zixor recognized as the luminar equivalent of laughing at themselves for being so completely wrong about someone they had judged so harshly. I have made a terrible mistake, Velketh finally said, and their voice carried frequencies of genuine remorse. I owe you an apology that words cannot adequately express. Word spread through the galactic confluence academy with the speed that gossip always traveled in communities where brilliant minds gathered. From across the stars, the human student who had been mocked and threatened with expulsion had been writing her examinations in binary code at microscopic scales, and every single answer had been correct, and more than correct, because she had been solving problems that professional researchers struggled with. Within 3 days, professors from every department requested access to Sarah Chun's examination papers to verify the claims that seemed too extraordinary to be believed, even with multiple witnesses confirming the discovery. Professor Velketh found themselves hosting continuous meetings in their office as colleagues examined the evidence under microscopes and reviewed the decoded translations while expressing amazement at the depth of understanding demonstrated by someone they had all dismissed as intellectually inferior. A Varath mathematician named Krelax, who specialized in topological transformations, spent 2 hours reviewing Sarah's work on the second examination before looking up with all 4 eyes wide in their deep purple face. She had solved the dimensional folding paradox, Krelax announced to the assembled professors who had gathered in Velkith's office. The proof is elegant and uses binary logic in ways that never occurred to me, because I was thinking in base 8 notation. Others crowded around to examine the specific sections Krelax indicated, and discussions erupted in multiple languages as beings from different mathematical traditions tried to understand how binary notation could provide insights that their own more complex systems had obscured. A crystalline scholar named Dexiamar, who taught advanced probability theory, examined Sarah's third examination with sensor arrays that extended their perception across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The information density here exceeds anything I have encountered in 50 years of academic research, Dexiamar observed, while their crystalline structure resonated with frequencies indicating profound respect. She has compressed graduate-level theoretical frameworks into spaces that most species would use for basic equation notation, Professor Velkith watched their colleagues process the same revelations they had experienced and felt their certainty about. Luminar intellectual superiority crumbling. Like ancient stone exposed to unexpected weather, the Galactic Academic Council convened an emergency session 2 weeks after the initial discovery, because the implications extended far beyond a single student's examination methods into questions about how different species approach knowledge and whether the galactic academic community had been systematically overlooking valuable perspectives by assuming certain forms of intelligence were superior to others. The council chamber occupied a massive spherical space where representatives from 40 member civilizations could participate simultaneously, whether they breathed oxygen or methane or existed as pure energy patterns. Contained in specialized housing, Sarah Chun stood at the center of the sphere on a platform that rotated slowly so all council members could observe her directly while she presented findings that had emerged from the investigation into her examination methods. Binary notation forces absolute clarity. Sarah began, and her voice was amplified through translation systems, so every being could understand regardless of their native communication methods. Every statement must be reduced to its most fundamental components. True or false? 1 or 0. Yes or no. She displayed examples of her work on holographic screens that floated throughout the chamber, showing how complex theoretical concepts could be expressed in binary code with precision that eliminated the ambiguities that plagued other notation systems. Most galactic species use base 8 or base 12, or more complex counting systems that evolved from your physiologies. Sarah continued while images showed different species' mathematical frameworks side by side. These systems allow for elegant shortcuts and intuitive relationships that binary cannot match in terms of efficiency, she acknowledged, which made several council members nod in agreement. But they also introduce assumptions and biases that can obscure fundamental relationships, Sarah said, and now displayed a specific example that made multiple council members lean forward with sudden interest. She showed how a long-standing contradiction between Warath mathematical frameworks and luminar crystalline logic could be resolved by translating both systems into pure binary and identifying where their underlying assumptions diverged in ways that neither species had recognized, because those assumptions were embedded so deeply in their notation that they had become invisible. Binary thought is not superior to other systems, Sarah emphasized, because she understood the danger of replacing one form of intellectual arrogance with another, but it provides a neutral ground where different frameworks can be compared directly without the distortions introduced by species-specific notation conventions. The chamber erupted in discussions that the translation systems struggled to keep separate as representatives debated implications that reached into every field of academic study, from theoretical physics to linguistic analysis. A representative from the Tetherian aggregate raised a manipulator appendage to request recognition, and the chamber quieted to hear their question. You suggest that humanity's reliance on binary computation is an advantage rather than a limitation, the Tetherian said with clicking sounds that translated into skeptical inquiry. But surely more complex systems process information more efficiently. Efficiency is not the same as accuracy, Sarah replied calmly. A system that processes information quickly but introduces systematic errors in translation between frameworks is less valuable than a slower system that maintains perfect fidelity, she displayed. Research showing how errors accumulated in complex calculations when different species mathematical frameworks interacted, and how these errors had gone undetected because everyone assumed their own notation system was fundamentally sound. Binary serves as a check on our assumptions, Sarah continued, by forcing us to break down our thinking into the most basic logical operations. We can identify where different systems diverge and why. A Luminar Council member who had been observing silently suddenly pulsed with bright light, that indicated urgent communication. This has implications for the unified field theory project, they announced, and everyone in the chamber recognized the significance because the unified field theory represented the Academy's most ambitious research initiative, attempting to reconcile contradictions between different species, understanding of fundamental physics. We've been trying to merge frameworks that contain incompatible assumptions, the Luminar continued, but we never recognized the incompatibilities because they were expressed in notation systems that made them seem equivalent. Sarah nodded in agreement and displayed additional materials she had prepared for exactly this realization. I have been working on a paper that addresses this issue, she said, and holographic screens filled with binary notation that translated in real time into multiple notation systems simultaneously by expressing the major frameworks in binary code. I have identified 3 fundamental assumptions that differ between species. Approaches to quantum mechanics, Sarah explained while highlighting specific sections. These assumptions are not wrong, but they lead to different predictions about how quantum effects manifest at cosmic scales. She showed how reconciling these assumptions required accepting that consciousness played a role in collapsing quantum probability functions through resonance effects that operated across dimensional boundaries in ways that current models had not adequately addressed. The chamber fell silent as hundreds of the galaxy's greatest minds processed what they were seeing and understood that a human student had potentially solved problems that had frustrated researchers for generations. Professor Velketh rose from their position among the Luminar delegation and requested permission to speak, which the council granted immediately. I must apologize publicly for my treatment of Sarah Chen, Velketh announced, and their harmonic voice carried throughout the chamber. I allowed prejudice and assumption to blind me to evidence that contradicted my beliefs about intellectual capability. The Luminar paused, and their crystalline structure flickered with light patterns that conveyed deep emotional processing. I believed Luminar superiority was self-evident and required no examination, Velketh continued. I was wrong, and my wrongness nearly cost the Academy and the galactic community access to insights that may reshape our understanding of reality itself. Other council members shifted uncomfortably because Velketh's confession forced them to confront their own assumptions about which species possessed superior intelligence and whether those assumptions had similarly blinded them to valuable knowledge. Sarah watched the proceedings with calm attention and waited while the council debated how to respond to revelations that challenged foundational assumptions about intelligence and capability. Finally, the council chair called for order and addressed Sarah directly. The council recognizes that your methods and insights represent significant contributions to galactic academic understanding, the chair announced formally. We request that you prepare a full presentation of your binary methodology for distribution across all member institutions. Sarah bowed respectfully, but then added quietly, I would also request that the Academy review its admission and evaluation procedures to ensure that different approaches to learning are recognized rather than dismissed. The chamber erupted in discussions again, but this time the tone was different. Instead of defending existing systems, representatives were questioning whether their institutions had been systematically excluding valuable perspectives by assuming their own species' methods were universally superior. Professor Velketh approached Sarah after the session concluded while other council members were still debating implications. I wish to study your methods formally, the professor said with humility that was remarkable for a Luminar. If you will accept me as your student rather than the reverse. Sarah smiled and extended her hand in the human gesture of agreement that Velketh had learned to recognize. I think we can learn from each other, Professor. 3 months after the council session, the Galactic Confluence Academy looked fundamentally different, not in its physical structure, but in the attitudes and approaches that characterized how students and professors engaged with knowledge and with each other across the boundaries that had previously divided species into hierarchies of perceived intellectual capability. Professor Velkith stood before their advanced quantum field theory class and announced that they were implementing significant changes to their teaching methodology. Based on insights gained from examining alternative approaches to expressing and processing complex information, we will be incorporating binary notation exercises into our curriculum, the professor explained, while their crystalline structure pulsed with light patterns that students had learned to recognize as enthusiasm rather than superiority. Not to replace your native mathematical frameworks, but to provide a common reference point that allows us to verify our assumptions. The class included students from 20 different species, including 5 humans who had enrolled after Sarah's breakthrough demonstrated that their species belonged at the Academy despite operating from different foundational premises than most galactic civilizations. In the front row of the lecture hall, Professor Velkith now sat as a student while Sarah Chun stood at the teaching podium preparing to deliver the first of what would become a series of guest lectures on binary methodologies and their applications to theoretical physics. The role reversal had caused controversy when first announced because Luminar did not typically accept instruction from species they had long considered intellectually inferior, but Velkith had insisted with crystalline determination that learning required humility and willingness to acknowledge when others possessed knowledge worth acquiring. Today, we will explore how binary logic can help identify hidden assumptions in quantum probability calculations. Sarah began, and her voice carried the same patient clarity she had demonstrated throughout her ordeal. But first, I want to emphasize that binary thinking is not superior to other approaches. She displayed side-by-side comparisons, showing how different species mathematical frameworks each offered unique advantages for different types of problems, and how the goal was not to replace these systems, but to create bridges between them. The Varth Base 8 system is exceptionally elegant for topological transformations, Sarah explained while showing specific examples. The Luminar crystalline logic allows for simultaneous processing of multiple probability states that binary must handle sequentially. Students throughout the hall relaxed slightly, because they had worried this new emphasis on binary would mean abandoning the methods their civilizations had developed over millennia. What binary provides is not a better system, but a translation layer, Sarah continued, a way to convert between the different frameworks while maintaining logical consistency and identifying where our assumptions diverge. She launched into the main lecture, demonstrating how to express quantum probability functions in binary notation and then translate them back into various species-specific frameworks while tracking where information was lost or assumptions were introduced during the conversion process. Professor Velkith took notes with the same intensity they had once reserved for their own research, while students around them whispered in amazement at seeing a Luminar scholar genuinely humbling themselves to learn from a human teacher. After the lecture ended, several students approached Sarah with questions that ranged from technical clarifications to broader inquiries about how humans had developed their relationship with binary thinking. A young crystalline scholar named Lixara asked the question that many were thinking: did your species always understand that binary could serve this bridging function, or was it discovered recently? Humans stumbled into it honestly, Sarah admitted with a smile. We built our computer technology on binary because it was the simplest system to implement mechanically with switches that were either on or off. She explained how humanity's relatively recent development of advanced technology meant they had no established mathematical traditions that needed to be protected from simplification. We had the freedom to embrace binary completely because we had no legacy systems that would be threatened by it, Sarah continued. Other species with thousands of years of mathematical development naturally preferred to enhance their existing frameworks rather than start over. The students absorbed this perspective, which reframed human limitations as potential advantages in specific contexts rather than evidence of inferiority. Over the following months, Sarah's binary methodology courses became some of the most sought-after offerings at the Academy, with waiting lists that extended across multiple terms because students from every department recognized the value of having a neutral framework for comparing different theoretical approaches. The linguistics department began using binary notation to analyze how different species languages encoded logical relationships in ways that shaped their capacity for certain types of abstract reasoning. The xenobiology program adopted binary frameworks for comparing genetic structures across radically different biochemistries, because base 2 notation could represent the fundamental presence or absence of specific molecular configurations without imposing assumptions about what those configurations meant. Even the arts and philosophy departments found applications for binary thinking and analyzing how different cultures approached questions of aesthetics and meaning through frameworks that either required or excluded middle positions between binary opposites. Professor Velkith published a joint paper with Sarah that revolutionized approaches to the unified field theory by demonstrating how 3 major theoretical frameworks could be reconciled once their underlying assumptions were translated into binary notation and compared directly. The paper won the prestigious Galactic Medal for Theoretical Physics, and both authors were invited to present their findings at conferences across dozens of worlds where researchers had struggled with the same contradictions that Sarah's methods had finally resolved. But perhaps the most significant change occurred not in research publications or academic prizes, but in the fundamental attitudes that characterized how species interacted within the academy community. Human students no longer faced assumptions about their intellectual inadequacy, and professors learned to examine their own biases before dismissing approaches that seemed primitive or inefficient. The Academy implemented new evaluation procedures that required multiple forms of assessment rather than relying solely on written examinations that might not accommodate different species communication preferences or processing styles. Students were encouraged to explain their thinking processes rather than merely providing answers, because faculty recognized that diversity in approach often indicated depth of understanding rather than confusion. Sarah continued her studies while teaching her binary methodology courses and conducting research that pushed boundaries in multiple fields simultaneously, because her approach revealed connections that had been obscured by the artificial divisions between disciplines that used incompatible notation systems. She developed close friendships with students from a dozen species who initially struggled to see past human limitations, but eventually recognized that intelligence manifested in countless forms and that no single species held monopoly on insight. Zixer became her primary research partner, and their combined Tetherian visual capabilities and human binary precision produced several breakthrough papers on quantum observation effects that could not have been achieved by either working alone. Professor Velkith transformed into one of the most vocal advocates for intellectual humility and diversity of approach throughout the galactic academic community, and frequently told the story of their own failures with Sarah's examinations as a cautionary tale about the dangers of assumption. 2 years after the initial discovery, Sarah stood before a packed auditorium that held 3,000 beings from 40 worlds who had gathered to hear her keynote address at the Galactic Conference on Epistemological Frameworks. We have learned that intelligence is not a single scale where some species rank higher than others. Sarah began, and her words were translated into hundreds of languages simultaneously. Intelligence is a multidimensional space where different approaches offer different strengths. She displayed a complex visualization showing how various species' cognitive frameworks excelled in different domains, and how the combinations of these frameworks produce capabilities that no single species could achieve. Alone, binary thinking is humanity's contribution to this collective intelligence. Sarah continued, not because it is superior, but because it fills a specific gap in the galactic toolkit. She explained how binary notation's requirement for absolute clarity complemented other species' more intuitive and holistic approaches by providing verification mechanisms that caught errors those systems might miss. Together we are smarter than any of us could be separately, Sarah concluded, but only if we recognize that different is not inferior and that every species has insights worth understanding. The auditorium erupted in approval expressed through sounds and lights and chemical signals that the translation systems could barely keep pace with as thousands of beings acknowledged a truth that seemed obvious once stated but had required one human student's persistence to make undeniable. Professor Velkith stood with the rest of the audience, and their crystalline structure glowed with pride in their student and teacher, who had taught them more than quantum physics could ever encompass. After the conference ended, Sarah walked through the Academy Gardens where plants from 100 worlds grew in carefully maintained environmental zones that allowed them to coexist despite requiring radically different conditions. She found her usual meditation spot on a bench position to watch the sunset, which on this world involved 3 suns setting in sequence, creating light patterns that humans found mesmerizing, but that other species barely noticed because their eyes were attuned to different wavelengths. Professor Velketh joined her without asking permission because they had moved past the formalities that once characterized their relationship. "You have changed the academy," the professor said quietly. "You have changed how we think about intelligence and capability. I just showed you what was already there." Sarah replied with characteristic modesty. The patterns were always visible if anyone had bothered to look closely enough. That is the nature of true insight, Velkith observed, making the invisible visible. Not through complexity, but through clarity. They sat together watching the triple sunset while students from across the curved galaxy hurried to evening classes where they would learn from each other across boundaries that had once seemed insurmountable, but now appeared as opportunities for collaboration. Sarah pulled out her paper notebook and began writing notes for her next research project using the tiny, precise binary notation that had sparked a revolution in galactic thinking. Velith watched with crystalline contentment and reflected on how much they had learned from the student they had once dismissed so completely. The universe was larger and stranger than any species could comprehend, alone but together with humility and willingness to recognize value in unexpected places. Civilization could push toward understanding that transcended the limitations any one perspective imposed. Sarah finished her notes and looked up at the darkening sky where stars were beginning to emerge, representing billions of worlds where intelligent life asked questions about existence and meaning. Humanity had joined that ancient conversation recently compared to most civilizations, but they had already contributed insights that would echo through generations because they had approached old problems with new eyes and had refused to accept that there was only one valid way to think. Academy would continue to evolve, and new species would join, bringing their own unique perspectives that would challenge and enrich the collective understanding. And somewhere in the vast cosmos, other students were probably struggling with professors who did not recognize their potential because it manifested differently than expected. Sarah hoped they would persist as she had done until someone finally looked closely enough to see what was there, because the most profound truths were often written in languages no one expected, requiring only patience and precision and the courage to express yourself in the notation that made sense to you, even when everyone else insisted it was wrong. The stars grew brighter, and Sarah smiled knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to demonstrate that humanity belonged among them.